In this video, we're going to look at the issue of representation in cognitive science. This is going to be a very brief primer. I'm going to just give you a couple of examples about what we mean by representation. But before I do that, I want to make sure that you have learned a little bit about indirect perception. I have another video on indirect perception, and if you go and watch that, it will give you a bit more background about why representation is important. In this first example, we have an example kind of representation. So people are probably quite aware of this, that if you, people did these, well, I guess surgeons, neuroscientists did these experiments, and they found out that there are certain areas of the brain, so in the sensory and the motor cortices, for example, that correspond or map to the body. And so what we have is this kind of representation of the body, and you can essentially treat the body as part of the external world. In our scheme, we're treating like the central nervous system as inside the black box, and everything outside that, including the body and the external world, is treated as the outside. And so we can see that the body, the external world, is represented in a certain way. It's called a topographic way, because nearby points upon your body are represented by nearby neurons in your cortex. So this is one example of a representation. Another example of a representation would be visual. So say we're looking at a scene, a complicated visual scene out of the window, or whatever it may be. We could ask, how is this visual scene represented in the brain? And further, we could ask, how is this visual scene represented in different parts of the visual processing hierarchy? Now, what we have learnt over quite a lot of time of neuroscience, this has also been mirrored by computational approaches, like deep learning, this kind of thing, is that at the early stages of visual processing, the world is represented in a quite simplistic way. We have neurons here which are sensitive to edges, points, contrast, and so on. And so you could say the external visual world is represented by a conglomeration of edges and lines at early points in the visual system. Now we could go and look at slightly later points in the visual system, such as area V2 or area V4, and we see that neurons here are most active in the presence of more complicated stimuli. So simplified shapes, simple objects, for example. And so you could say the external world is represented in area V4, for example, as a conglomeration of different types of objects. And further, the higher you go up the hierarchy, so here IT represents the inferior temporal cortex. This is known to be particularly responsive to faces, but of course there are other higher order visual processing areas which are more sensitive to other types of things, maybe movements, colours, different types of objects, and so on. So this is another concrete example of the kind of thing that cognitive scientists and beyond would mean when they're talking about how is the world represented in the brain. Another example here, which is slightly more kind of abstract, difficult to show you a picture here. Another kind of long-running debate about the way in which the world is represented in your brain is the question of where is the representation on the spectrum of being sparse versus distributed. So the idea of a sparse type of representation in the brain is essentially saying that each neuron has an extremely exquisite sensitivity to one particular thing. And classically, the classic example used to demonstrate this is that if this is true, then there must be one or at least one neuron in your brain that will become strongly active when you are looking at your grandmother. Now, this is interesting and has all kinds of consequences. So it predicts that we should have neurons for looking at every single possible thing. And it raises questions of, well, what about viewing my grandmother from kind of one angle versus another angle? Is that the job of different neurons or the same one? Now, the kind of opposite, if you like, on this spectrum is a distributed representation. And so in this way of thinking about things, rather than having neurons that respond highly selectively to particular stimuli like grandmothers or cars or whatever, you instead have a broad activity. If you look at one particular thing, you may see a broad activity across many different neurons. And so this is why it's called distributed, because you could say that the neural representation of your grandmother is distributed over many different neurons. And so if you looked at your grandmother on consecutive days, you might expect the same distributed set of neurons to be active. As an example, just to kind of flesh this out a bit, there are many different ways in which a distributed kind of representation could be constructed, but one typical way that people might think of it is that where you would look at something, your grandmother, and you would essentially, what your nervous system, what your visual system might be doing is to analyze, to separate the complicated image received on your retina into a wide number of attributes. And so you might instead have neurons that respond to hair colors, facial expressions, skin color, glasses, all kinds of different things. So hopefully this video has been useful. I've given you 3 concrete examples of what is meant by representation.